Going beyond the headlines. Asking the questions you want answered. Exploring government policies and how they impact you. We are delving deeper.
Good evening and welcome to Delving Deeper. I am your host, Ayana Carter. Now, debate on the 2024 budget presentation is expected to continue in the Parliament this coming week. So joining us on the show this evening are economists Dr. Marlene Attzs and Dr. Dave Seerattan. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Thank you.
So Dr. Attzs, let's begin with you. What are your thoughts on the 2024 budget?
Well, honestly, I think given the circumstances where we are, the declines in the energy sector, I think it was a fair budget. I think the government has tried to kind of navigate a very tight space in terms of the revenues that are available to it from the main source of income for Trinidad and Tobago from the energy sector. So I would say that all in all, it was a fair budget. I didn't expect, too many surprises inside of there. So I would have to give it a fair.
All right. And Dr. Seerattan, what are your thoughts?
Well, the budget, people have to understand that a budget is not a standalone event. This is, the minister mentioned, is the 8th budget. And the budget is couched in a medium-term macroeconomic strategy. So normally when you're going through these programs, especially in the position we found ourselves after 2014, you necessarily needed to have some level of stabilization. So that came first. And normally, you would have tried to transition to the growth stage 3 years down the road, but then COVID happened, and we had to kind of switch gears and so on. So I think now, last year and this year, the government is demonstrating that they're now looking for growth and to be on offense rather than defense. So yeah. The budget, some of the policies they have adopted is a continuation of what happened in last year, in 2023, but it's obvious that the governments want to push on, especially to push growth a little more strongly.
Yeah. What are some of the major takeaways from the budget presentation?
I think the major takeaway is that although the energy sector is for the foreseeable future going to be our dominant sectors, I think there is recognition on the part of the government that we need to start transitioning to kind of lower our dependence on those sectors. It's not that those sectors are not important to us, but you need to recognize that we are at a mature stage in the development of the petroleum sector and the energy sector, and if you want to really get higher rates of growth that we have witnessed in the past, you need to transition to other growth pools. And the minister talked about the agriculture sector, but more importantly, I think we need to look to the tourism sector, which is, to me, going to be one of the most important sectors going forward. And of course, Trinidad and Tobago is in the Caribbean. The Caribbean already have a brand in terms of the international tourism industry. It's just that we need to do some things, some of which were mentioned in the budget by the minister, but I think we need to kind of take it a whole new different level now, and to recognize that this is going to be probably not the first, but one of the second most important sectors in the economy in the future.
Okay. And Dr. Attzs, do you agree? What are some of your major takeaways?
I mean, the question of whether or not the economy has been growing is not something that I would necessarily agree with. I think that we've seen low and very slow economic growth in terms of what has been happening because of our heavy dependence on the oil and gas sector. And we know what has been happening globally. And since we're price takers, very little has been happening. We've seen plants that have been dormant since the closure of Petrotrin. That has also impacted on employment, etc. But we're seeing, we don't have sufficient gas. So we're seeing that some some of our industries have in fact been operating at less than full capacity. So it has been impacting employment and economic activity generally. But moving forward, I mean, I take the point from Dr. Seerattan that really and truly we need to look for the diversification. But I would want to stick a pin. We have been so heavily dependent on the energy sector, and even though there have been declines in that sector in terms of government revenue, we've not kind of caused the pendulum shift that we require to reflect that it is not business as usual for us in Trinidad and Tobago. So, you know, mention was made of the agriculture sector. We moved from a food import bill of just over $5 billion in 2019-20, to a food import bill of over $7 billion, which is a reflection that there's not been full cognizance taken of the circumstances that we face in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think that while mention has been made for several decades of economic diversification, now is really the time for us to cause that pendulum to be swung in another direction, even as we use the revenues from the energy sector to help us finance that economic diversification and that transition that we need to see. I mean, I like the point that was made about tourism, and the Minister of Finance did mention some sectors in the budget. He talked about yachting, maritime, etc. But I also think, and I know, you know, Dr. Seerattan spoke about tourism in the traditional sense, but I think that there is an opportunity for us to focus on carnival and festivals as a as that creative sector, you know, what they're calling the orange economy, to focus on that as a growth pool, because we've seen the impact that Carnival has had and the impact that it has from an economic perspective. I don't think we've fully capitalized on that potential. Carnival tends to be a kind of loose business, and the leakages from the Carnival sector. So I think if we were to focus on that, we just had Trinidad and Tobago on the international stage in terms of World Steel Pan Day. That is an opportunity for us to also capitalize and to identify things that are close to home, that gets the population energized and engaged, and we can use those once we manage them in a sustainable manner to help diversify the economy. So in addition to what the minister would have mentioned in his budget presentation, I think there are other opportunities that we can look at separate, in addition to the traditional tourism, sun, sea and sand, but also looking at kind of promoting our festivals.
Do you think, though, that enough is being done in order to promote this diversification plan?
No, I think it's a conversation that we've had on the back burner, and part of the reason I think that we've not kind of advanced the conversation is because we always had the energy sector to fall back on. Right. I think it's only since about 2014, 2015 that we're starting to embrace the fact that it is not business as usual. And then, of course, when we had COVID-19 and then the invasion, the Russian and Ukraine conflict, I think that brought the point home in a very cogent way to the population that things are a little different. And I think there is now beginning to be that deeper understanding by the population. So it's no longer the government alone saying something. I think there's now a full appreciation that it can't be business as usual. So we need to look elsewhere. But we always, having had the conversation and putting the diversification conversation on the table, we always kind of fall back to a position of comfort that says, well, you know, things aren't too bad. You know, we got some additional revenue from the energy sector based on what was happening globally.
Yeah. And Dr. Seerattan, in terms of diversification, what are your thoughts in terms of the government pushing toward that diversification plan?
Well, this is a challenge that we have had since independence. If you look at some of the first development plans that we have had, every one of them from 1962 come all the way up to the present have mentioned this whole issue about diversification. And I don't want the population at large to believe that we have done nothing. I mean, to say, when you look at diversification, you know, people talk about diversification, and I smile sometimes when I hear economists, even economists, talking about the need to diversify and so on. It's a very complicated process. So I would say we have diversified to some extent. So, for example, in the old days, it would have simply been the petroleum industry. But when we talk about the energy industry today, it's not just the petroleum industry. We are now a fundamentally gas-based industry. There's a petrochemical sector that generates a whole set of revenues for the government and so on. So we have diversified. It's just that we have diversified a little bit within the energy sector, and that creates some challenges for us. We have also made some strides in the light manufacturing sector and so on. But to me, as Dr. Attzs mentioned, because we have certain incentives built into the economy when you are an energy-based economy, it is very difficult to transition. So, for example, the government does not diversify. It's the private sector, is private individuals and so on that helps with the diversification. But the government's kind of help with the enabling environment and those kinds of things, and they could provide seed capital in some areas, develop industrial parks and those kinds of things. But to really move the economy to that different stage where you are less dependent on the energy sector, you need private actors to take the lead, so to speak. And I often tell people, if you have a businessman who has capital, the capitalist class in this country, who has money to make the investment and to transition, but you earning 30, 40% returns on your investment simply by importing stuff and reselling it in Trinidad and Tobago, what incentives are there for you to go and get in the very difficult and challenging world of the export sector, and you might not even get the 30% that you have again. So there are private incentives, and that makes it difficult to transition. And in terms of the diversification effort, I always cite the example of the Eastern Caribbean countries. The Eastern Caribbean countries, if you're familiar with that period, I mean to say they were dependent on bananas and the preferential regime by the English and so on. When the WTO blew up the banana regime in the early 1990s, and it ended in 1995, that is when the OECS countries really started to transition. So now when you go to any of the OECS countries, they're predominantly tourism and financial services-based industry. And that happened in the space of 15 years from 1995 to 2010. So I think part of what Dr. Attzs said is true, and people have a certain level of comfort because they could make really good returns and a good living, basically feeding off the petroleum sectors and so on. And you really have to put things in place to incentivize people moving into other sectors and so on. And one of the things that we have realized inadvertently is that this whole thing about diversification is tied to all the issues we have in the FX market. Yeah. And you will never solve the fundamental problems and imbalances we have in the FX market until you get people involved in the tradable sector and exports, and you get people thinking about different ways in terms of different tastes and so on that we have. So, for example, the taste patterns we have are for foreign goods and services, and we have to, that is a generational kind of change. So sometimes when people talk about diversification, they don't appreciate where we have come since 1962. Secondly, how difficult it is to transition. Not many countries in the developing world have managed to do it. And thirdly, the fact that, this is something that takes a very, very long time, and you have to have a level of patience to ensure that you get the right incentives in place and so on. But I have no doubt that in the future, when as the energy sector, the returns from the energy sector start to dwindle, that you will see more and more of our private sector people getting involved in the tradable sector and exporting and so on. We already have a pretty credible record in that regard and so on. So I think that definitely the country has been on the right path. I just think that we need to take it to the different level. When you look at the different elements in the budget that the minister mentioned in terms of the agriculture sector and the tourism sector, you get a sense that, we are kind of going up, addressing the problem in a kind of very gradual approach, where I feel, especially if you want to see significant change, you want a big bang kind of approach. And the kinds of investment you want to see, especially in the physical plant and equipment in the Caribbean and the tourism sector, is significantly more than we have invested. And this is not to say that Trinidad have done bad. This problem about the physical plant and equipment problem in the tourism industry is not a Trinidad and Tobago centric problem. If you go up and down the Caribbean, that, with the exception of the Bahamas probably, everybody have encountered a problem. I'll give the example of the Barbados Hilton. That property was redeveloped completely about a decade ago. And if you go to the Hilton now, you see signs already of decay and need for a capital infusion. The problem that we face in our economies is that the kinds of investment in US dollars you have to make to backstop the redevelopment of the physical plant and equipment in the tourism sector in the Caribbean is huge, and in most cases, our governments and the private sector do have that base to do those things. So in a way, you have to align the development of the tourism sector with foreign direct investment and the whole regime for attracting foreign investment and so on. But so that, I think people don't appreciate how difficult it is in the best of circumstances and with the best will and with the right policies and so on, how difficult it is to transition an economy from one dominant sector to a couple. And of course, you know, that lack of appreciation of the difficulty sometimes manifests itself in a certain level of impatience that people have in the economy. And I should make this point as well. In a small countries like Trinidad and Tobago, I know Dr. Attzs talked about the yachting industry and so on. But when you are a developing country, and we are a very small developing country, 1.4 million people, that is very, very small. Yeah. You have factor endowment issues that you cannot get into 1,000,001 different sectors. So Trinidad and Tobago, even if everything went to plan, would never be as diversified as a larger, more dominant economy. So I think we need to also be very selective. So I mean to say, if you go through some of the development plans, you will see that they have identified certain sectors, which is the tourism sector, the agricultural sector, the health tourism kind of arrangement, the yachting industry, and a whole host of other things. But you know, that's a wish list, and we have to recognize that if we really want to make huge strides, we have to be very selective. And to me, the first sector that we need to pay and devote most of our attention to is the tourism sector. And the second one is agriculture, not only because it is going to help us in terms of our vulnerabilities on the export side and on the import side, because to me, the agricultural sector is not so much going to help us in terms of export revenues, but is going to help us replace some of the imports that we see, that we have seen the escalation of in recent past. Dr. Attzs mentioned the $7 billion for the food import bill. But if you look at the breakdown on the food import bill again, you know, fresh fruits and vegetables and so on, which is what we probably could make a significant dent in, is not really the largest component of the of those things. So again, we have to think strategically about what exactly we want to do, so that we could deploy our scarce resources in very strategic ways to get the kind of change that we want. But I think especially in the tourism sector, we have to make much larger investment in the physical plant and equipment if we want to really make a dent in the diversification effort.
Can I say that, I mean, while I appreciate a lot of what Dr. Seerattan has said, I disagree in terms of the focus, because I think when you have a food import bill that is escalating, that is also using up scarce foreign exchange resources, that, you know, is subjected to global inflationary pressures, and it is growing. I mean, you move from 5 to 7 billion, you have a CARICOM commitment to reduce your food import bill by 25% by 2025, which of course Trinidad and Tobago is not going to keep. You have a sustainable development goal commitment by 2030 to ensure that you reduce your food import bill, you increase food security. I think there is some urgent need, and while people have developed tastes, so I would agree with Dr. Seerattan that the point is that people have developed tastes over years, and we've allowed that to go unchecked, and now we're finding ourselves at a crossroads where we simply do not have the financial resources to support that kind of lifestyle. I mean, we have transfers and subsidies, we have a whole host of other expenditures that really are going to challenge the government in terms of their revenue streams and how they're going to actually deal with all of these priorities. So that's the first thing. The second thing is on the point of tourism. I don't know that Trinidad and Tobago can compete. I think if insofar as we look at tourism, I think it has to be a niche tourism market as opposed to the traditional tourism market, sun, sea, and sand, because we're really late bloomers in terms of that particular aspect. So I think it makes little sense for us to try to compete with a Grenada or Barbados or Jamaica, as the case might be, or the Bahamas or St. Lucia, as the case might be. But if we were to look for a niche market in terms of that tourism sector, perhaps that is something that can, kind of position us differently in terms of some foreign exchange earnings. The other thing is, on the question of tourism, I think it would be, insensitive of us to think that we can actually have a vibrant tourism sector when we're still having conversations around the level of crime and the public concerns that we have around crime. I mean, that in itself is going to be a marketing challenge for us as a country if we're trying to get people to come to our country as a tourism destination, and we've not quite got a handle on the crime situation in the country. And that is a pain point that I think we need to address frontally, because it impacts on a whole host of other things. So tourism, for example, it will impact on foreign direct investment, it will impact on investors wanting to come into the country. So I think we really have to prioritize, while I take the point that, the diversification, and with the diversification, I think requires some other enabling environments in terms of how do we structurally readjust our economic circumstances and also our mindsets. I think we really have to prioritize, because the safety and security issues are really clouding a whole lot of other things that can potentially happen in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is something that we have to address. So while tourism is going to be an opportunity for us, I think we really have to be strategic in terms of how we have that conversation, so that we don't try to become like the other tourism destinations, because we're really very late in terms of the tourism life cycle. But there is an opportunity, as I said, for some niche tourism sectors for us in Trinidad and Tobago, but that can only be predicated on our getting the safety and security issues. I think we having some kind of check on those issues.
Now, Dr. Attzs, you mentioned national security. Now, national security, education, and health, again, received the major portion of the budgetary allocation this year. Now, do you think that persons are seeing the return of investment, so to say, by the government allocating majority of funds, again, in our allocation?
To those sectors?
Yeah.
All right. In terms of education and health, which are the easier ones, I think we can't argue that we've seen returns on the investment over the years. I mean, Trinidad and Tobago has what we call high human development according to the United Nations. We rank, I think our rank is 0.8 out of between 0 and 1. So, and that measures education, health, and per capita income. So Trinidad and Tobago does pretty decently inside of there. I mean, we have some challenges with illiteracy, but by and large, we have a well-educated population. And we have a fairly decent healthcare system. I mean, we can argue on the margin again about, efficiencies, etc. But we do have pretty sophisticated education and healthcare systems. And as I mentioned earlier, the pain point really comes down to national security. And I think citizens, well, a couple of things I want to say. I think one, a question that always occurs to me, and I'm not a criminologist, but I certainly do think that if one is investing heavily in a particular sector, one has to do some sort of analysis on whether or not you're getting the return on the investment. And crime and security is a dynamic issue, and I think one of the first things that we need to really consider is whether or not our current national security infrastructure, and I'm using the totality of Ministry of National Security, is fit for purpose in terms of some of the challenges that we're seeing, and recognizing that crime and security is dynamic. So you have cybersecurity now, which we didn't have 20 years ago. Whether or not we are in fact built for purpose in terms of the contemporary issues that we're seeing. I looked at some data from the TTPS recently in terms of the number of young persons involved in crime, and again, whether or not we are fit for purpose in terms of that. Certainly, if you look at some metrics other than money, because it's not simply about the allocation.
Right.
So some of the other metrics in terms of how the public perceives safety and security in the country, whether or not we have adequate border controls, whether or not we're seeing efficiency in terms of response time to incidents, or even the extent to which we can actually solve some of the crimes that we're seeing. I think those are some of the metrics that we have to build in, and then ask ourselves reasonably whether or not our institutional framework for national security is in fact fit for purpose in 2023 and beyond. And I think it's on that basis we can then determine whether or not the investment should be more, should be less, or what we need to do to make the institutional framework more robust. So for me, the issue is not so much about the money, but about whether or not we're actually seeing the kinds of changes that we would want to see in terms of some of those metrics that I would have identified. And I think that is where the analysis ought to begin, whether or not the current institutional framework that we have for dealing with national security really is appropriate to what we're seeing happening. Cybersecurity is one of the things that I would have mentioned. 20 years ago, we didn't have as much of a challenge, but now it's a major issue. And we have to kind of, do that deep dive to see whether or not we are, in fact, fit for purpose moving along. But certainly on the education and health front, we can, I think, as I said, with some, on the margin, some concerns, but we do have a well-educated population and we do have fairly decent levels of healthcare systems in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah. And Dr. Seerattan, do you think that the general public, they're seeing a return on their investment with regard to education, health, and national security?
I think when you look at the breakdown of the allocations for the different functions of government, health, education, and so on, I think if you look 10 years, 20 years back down the road, it would have been relatively similar. I think it's noteworthy that in this year's budget, the largest increase in the allocation came to national security, $1.2 billion, right? And that is a reflection of the fact that probably the main challenge that we face, surpassing all the economic challenges that we have, is the whole issue about crime and so on. And Dr. Attzs is correct that if you want to push on in terms of diversification, especially if you're thinking about tourism as your main focal point, you need to deal with the problem of crime. I mean to say, I remember a couple of years ago when I visited Barbados, there's this place called the Gap, St. Lawrence Gap in Barbados. And I had a friend from the central banks and we walked from one end of the Gap to the next. And he kept shaking the hands of numerous people along the way. And so I was saying, who are these people? He said, every one of those people I met were policemen in plain clothes. So the problem about crime is not particular to Trinidad and Tobago. We have a particularly difficult challenge because we are the tip of South America on the edges of the transshipment point for drugs and illegal weapons and those kinds of things. So we have a much more difficult challenge than the rest of the Caribbean. But the fact that countries in the Caribbean with much less resources that we have managed to keep a handle on it is testament to the fact that we could do better on crime. And I think if we want to talk about foreign direct investment, as Dr. Attzs mentioned, and particularly if we want to talk about transitioning, probably using tourism as a focal point to help with that transition, you need to sort out the issue with crime. I mean to say, the Jamaicans have almost as big a problem with crime as we do. And if you go to Mobe, that's the other part of Jamaica, so it doesn't have the same kind of challenges that in Kingston. So we have a similar kind of situation with Tobago that doesn't have the same kind of issues with crime as we do. So, in the midst of all the problems and the challenges we have, that you should not wait until everything is perfect to make the move in terms of transitioning. And, because in life, if you wait on the perfect moment, you will never make the moment to transition. And on that score, I think we also need to do something about the national environment. I mean to say, I remember as a child going up to the drive up to Maracas, which is one of our main kind of tourist areas or destination. And the pristine greenery and the views when you crested the hill and you were going down the hill, that was beautiful. Now when you go to Maracas, there are a slew of shanties, derelict cars on the side of the road, garbage strewn outside the car park, those kinds of things. If you want to be serious about tourism, you have to get a handle on those things. And I think when you look at the other Caribbean countries, there are numerous programs and so on that the government have launched to educate the population about how important the tourism sector is to us. So for example, this whole thing about cleaning up the national environment is not only right in its own, it's not only a good thing in its own right, it is because this is what we depend on, right? I remember some years ago in Barbados, the Barbados government had actually a program telling people and trying to encourage people to treat people a certain way in terms of how they greet them and those kinds of things. And all those kinds of things are important for the tourism drive. If you go to Miami and you go to a hotel, when you meet the counter staff and so on, there's a certain, you always put your best people in terms of personality and so on in the areas where you actually interact with staff on an intensive basis. So, you know, those are the kinds of things that we need to change. Is an attitudinal change and so on. And the reason I'm harping so much on tourism is because of all the things that Marlene and myself may have mentioned. All the different sectors we may have identified in our various development plans and so on. That is the only sector that has the potential to replace a significant amount of the effects that we would lose over time in relation to things. So all the things like yachting and all those things are wonderful, and you know, but if you know that this is the low-hanging fruit, this is the sector that could potentially help replace some of the lost FX earning that we have lost as the energy sector transition to a lower level, then you obviously have to pay more attention to that. And what I'm saying, we already have a foothold. We already have the Caribbean brand and all the lovely things that Dr. Attzs talked about in terms of niche tourism and so on. We are doing it. That's why we have a tourism agency for Tobago especially, and a tourism, because it's two different destinations and you have to market them differently and so on. So I think the authorities recognize all these challenges that we have. It's often the case that, you know, we think we have come up with these brilliant ideas, yeah. But when you really get into the belly of the beast and you discuss it with people on the ground in the Ministry of Finance, in the tourism agencies and so on, you realize that all the things that you have been thinking about, they have been there, done that, and the problem they face is a problem of resources, one, and a problem of focus, two, right? And so if you get those two things right, in terms of the resources and the focus, I think we can make a significant change in terms of how we transition. If the OECS countries with much less resources, human as well, the human resources are a very important part of it. We have very good people. If you go, you know, there is this notion that the public service is this bureaucratic place where you don't get things done. My interaction with public servants, we have some of the best people around the region in our public services. We just have to find a way to marshal them and incentivize them in a particular way to get the job done. And that involves access to resources, which include training, and of course the focus on these things that we need to get done.
In your opinion, what impact does the budget have on the average citizen?
I think that people have to recognize, because the state has such a large footprint in Trinidad and Tobago, whatever the government does has significant implications, not only for Joe Public, but for the business sector. Because I mean to say, people often talk about reducing government expenditure without understanding how interconnected the state and the private sector is. So if the minister, for example, was to cut, as I advocated before, as I pointed out before, cut expenditure below a certain threshold, you are actually going to be hurting the long-term development trajectory for Trinidad and Tobago. So until we get a point where the private sector is as robust as in some other countries, the state has an important role to play. And by definition, the kinds of things that they do have huge implications for the welfare levels, not only in terms of the general population, but for the business sector. That is why the business sector always seeks to have some kind of very, very strong relationship with the government, because they recognize that in a country like ours, you have to have that kind of cooperation if you want to get anything done. The economy, I think I mentioned this on the last time I was in this program, the economy is a living organism, yeah. Right? And one part affects how all the other part functions and so on. And once people realize that, this whole issue about my interests vis-a-vis their interests is going to fall by the wayside, because we are all interconnected. And we need to know at different points in time whose interest is more important for the overall welfare of the country. Whether it's low income people, whether sometimes we need to prioritize the business sector above all else, because we have certain challenges coming our way. So I think once the population kind of gets an appreciation for the challenges we face and how important policies are in their daily lives and so on, and for the children, future and so on, that people would start having a better appreciation, and we'll start developing greater consensus on some of the important areas that we need consensus. Because one of the things bedevil in Trinidad and Tobago from the beginning in 1962 is that we don't have consensus on some of the most important things. And when we don't have consensus in the development exercise, you tend to take 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward sometimes, because you don't, in the important areas in terms of crime, in terms of economic policy, in terms of economic focus, you know, when one administration transitions to the other, we don't have continuity. So I think it's very important for us to have consensus on the big ticket items, especially like crime, and in terms of the foreign exchange market, in terms of foreign direct investment, and in terms of the sectors that we want to push. And once we have those things, I think we will see better traction over time in terms of how we go forward in a kind of organized way, no matter who is in power, right? And that is something that the media has a very important role to play in fostering, right? That need for consensus in order to make headway on the difficult issues is one of the main challenges that Trinidad and Tobago face and will face in the foreseeable future.
Right. Now, Dr. Attzs, Dr. Seerattan mentioned it in his example in terms of what the average citizen takes away from any budget presentation. The price of gas going up.
That's correct. Cigarettes going up.
Cigarettes,
yes.
Alcohol, food prices, you know, those things are what the average citizen really looks at when you're talking about a budget presentation. But what else, in your opinion, do citizens really need to hone in on when, you know, we have these annual budget presentations?
All right. Thanks for the opportunity to, you know, kind of zone in on that, because I think it's a tragedy that our population, I think, doesn't understand how Trinidad and Tobago functions. They see the government as the people who read the budget and who raise the price of rum and who raise the price of this and who raise the price of gas, etc., etc. And I think while those are honest opinions, and I think you know, touch and feel issues, and I think I don't discount them for a moment, because at the end of the day, you want to go to the supermarket, you want to jump in a vehicle, you want to do X, Y, and Z for your personal enjoyment. So what the government does at the macro level will impact on the average citizen. But I think there is insufficient understanding of how the economy functions. And let me just kind of weigh in on what I mean by that. If Trinidad and Tobago is essentially oil and gas, the difference to the average person matters not whether now we're more gas or more oil, or it matters not to the average citizen. They know it comes from the energy sector. And that sector is challenged, meaning that the government is not earning as much revenue as it used to. And that sector was the sector that brought in a lot of the foreign exchange. Then unless that is communicated in a way that the average Trinbagonian can embrace that, then the government is going to find itself even more challenged, because you're going to be challenged in terms of your revenue streams, but you're also going to be challenged in terms of a population that is demanding things from you that you are having difficulty to provide. And let us not lose the fact that we're going into pretty swiftly into an election period in Trinidad and Tobago. So the population is going to be looking for sweeteners. They're going to be looking for enticements and inducements to persuade them to behave a particular way. But if the population doesn't understand the challenge that we're facing, this then becomes the Minister of Finance's budget, and the Minister of Finance's this, etc., etc. So whether we want to talk about the business sector, that means absolutely nothing to the average Trinbagonian. The average Trinbagonian is interested in the fact that the minimum wage would have increased, and they probably have the opportunity to take more money home, but they are smart enough to know that having a little more money in my pocket, if I were at the minimum at the $17.50 and I'm now going to be at the $20.50 level, I have a little more money in my pocket, but they will ask themselves whether or not, A, if the price of gas goes up again, if that will impact on the additional $300 or thereabouts that I have. If the price of food continues to increase, then they will ask themselves whether or not the additional $300 that I now have, whether or not I will be able to spend more money in the grocery, whether I'll be able to have a better Christmas this year than I had last year, as it were. So for us, to me, one of the things I try to do always when I have the opportunity to chat about the economy is to bring it down to the level of what the average Trinbagonian can understand, because I think at the end of the day, we all want to live comfortably in a space, but I think we can do a better job of explaining the nuances of Trinidad and Tobago, as opposed to it simply being a conversation around the 30th to the 5th of October, where everybody is, you know, ears pressed to a radio, glued to a television, wondering whether rum going up and cigarettes going on. I think we have to elevate the conversations, and that's why I welcome the opportunity to come in and have a chat on this program, so that we can, at least in our spheres, understand what is happening. The other thing that I also want to use this opportunity is, one of the things I teach at UWI is a specialized course on environmental economics, and this year it was a surprise to me that the students didn't quite understand how significant the environment is to an economy such as Trinidad and Tobago's. We depend heavily on what we call a non-renewable depleting resource. So when we extract oil, when we extract gas, it ain't coming back. So what we have to do is to maximize the returns on the revenue that we get from it. Similarly, Dr. Seerattan is talking about tourism. Those economies that are heavily dependent, again, that's the environment. And if something happens to impact on that, there will be an economic impact and a people impact. And he's absolutely correct. I'm so happy that he made the point that the economy is not a static notion, and it's certainly not the Minister of Finance economy, and it's certainly not the government economy. It's our economy, it's our living space where we and our children, and generations to come want to enjoy this space. So we have to manage our affairs, and I think that nuance is lost on the average Trinbagonian in terms of how the Trinidad and Tobago economy operates. So we talk about what is happening in Jamaica, we talk about what is happening in Barbados, so we certainly talk about what's happening in the United States. But their economic circumstances are different from ours, and I think it requires a collective effort, but also a collective understanding of Trinidad and Tobago, so that we can move forward and help our economy be the prosperous place that we want to enjoy.
Yeah. Now, one of the issues that persons have been, being to and fro on is the proposed increase for electricity rates.
Yes.
And, of course, property tax, residential property tax.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that, what advice then would you give to the government and the revenue authorities that are in charge of these aspects? What advice would you give to them in order for persons to buy into that, that these issues are happening and this is the way to rectify them?
All right. Couple things. First, I want to commend the Minister of Finance for, again, very painstakingly going through the property tax and how it is going to be implemented. I thought he's probably tired of having to do that, but I thought it was useful to break it down in a way that is palatable, because there is a lot of anxiety around the property tax and people thinking that it is going to be an additional cost to homeowners, but I think there is a lot of anxiety around it and what it would mean, and it's $1,000 and it's a lot of money and that sort of thing. So I thought he was very good to painstakingly kind of map out how it's going to be calculated, and he also gave some indicative figures. It could be $64 for some people a month, etc., etc., etc. So that I think that was, the population likes bite-sized pieces so that they can digest it more easily, no pun intended. Yeah. So I think that it is useful, again, that he also mentioned that this tax has been on the table for many years. Yeah. What the government is seeking to do is to link the property tax with local government reforms so that municipalities can now have resources available to them to allow them to do their business in a way that does not depend totally on the central government giving them an allocation.
Yes.
Of course, the challenge inside of there is that some municipalities, certainly the more affluent areas, are probably likely to collect more taxes, more property taxes as it were. So I think that needs to be kind of worked out so that people aren't necessarily disadvantaged. We all want garbage collection 5 days a week. We all want all sorts of things. We want to have our roads cleaned, etc., etc., etc. So I think it was a very useful discourse in terms of putting the property tax, and certainly I always say, from my personal perspective, I would like to know that I'm paying property tax, small amounts, so that I can have the opportunity to call and say garbage hasn't been collected on my street for the last 2 days. So it gives me some kind of consumer power, so to speak, that I can therefore call my regional corporation and have that conversation with them. With respect to the utility rates, It is not a secret that we have enjoyed, again because of our energy sector and because we have benefited from the subsidies from the energy sector, that we enjoy some of the lowest rates in the Caribbean. Now, I think it is an opportunity. So again, there is need for us to communicate to the average Trinbagonian what your bill may look like, and there have been some conversations by the Minister of Public Utilities and the RIC in their consultations in terms of persons who are on the lower end of the scale, the more vulnerable, that they're going to not, have to face the additional hardship. Where I would, however, like to see some conversation is in terms of, we talk about SMEs as if small and medium enterprises, as if it's a homogeneous group. Not all SMEs are created the same way. So those nano and micro, those one-person enterprises where I'm the only person, and if you look at the CSO's register of businesses from 2018, out of the 26,000 registered, we have 7,000 small business enterprises that are between 0 and 1 person. A further 4,000 that are between 2 and 4 persons alone in the business. So these are not the same as your SME where you might have 100 persons. So therefore their needs are different. And I think in the calibration and the rolling out of certainly the electricity rates, I think those nuances need to be taken into consideration. So the hairdresser for whom using electricity every day, so the air condition and the dryers and the this and the that, for whom they may see a spike that may put some pressure on their businesses, because remember we're also now in recovery stage post-COVID, so business is now picking back up as the case might be. Let's have some conversations around how we can ease such persons into the fray in terms of having the higher rates as it were. So I think those are conversations still to be had, but I think as responsible consumers, part of an economic system, and I'm coming back to the fact that we are all part of the economy, I think we need to do what we need to do in terms of taxation, in terms of where the taxes are, but I also think that there is an opportunity for there to be conversations in terms of how you ease the more vulnerable, not only the ones who are at the lower end of the income scale, but also those micro entrepreneurs, those one business persons, the hairdresser who's managing her salon. I do know some of those people who have, who've already seen, because of the hot weather that we've been having, they've already seen some spikes in their electricity bills, and they're kind of wondering what's going on here. They introduced the higher rates already, and I said, no, it's just because you're consuming more energy, so it's being reflected in your bill. So I think there has to be a conversation, and I mentioned at another forum, perhaps think about reaching out to these businesses instead of calling them and saying that, you're about to cut your lights because you didn't pay your bill. Reach out to them and suggest a payment plan, for example, if there are some circumstances, because you never can tell what circumstances people are going through that might result in them not making their payment on time. It's not as if we're giving them a reprieve because you have to pay your bill, but certainly engage in conversations, because I know some persons who, as the new school year started, had to make choices between buying books, buying this, buying uniforms, etc., etc. So it's really a question of money management. So I think both on the property tax and the high electricity rates, I think these are issues that we have to face as citizens in Trinidad and Tobago, and it's really just how do we have the conversations to execute them in a way that is, minimizes the pain to the average citizen, as it were.
Okay. Dr. Seerattan, the budget is pegged on its US $85 per barrel. Are you in agreement with this estimation?
Well, if you listen to the budget presentation or you read the budget presentation, you will see that the minister was at pains to explain
how he arrived
the logic
at that,
of how we came about with the $85 a barrel. And that's actually not the more important figure. The more important figure is on the gas side. And a lot of people confuse the gas sides with the price quoted on the American natural gas, which is the Henry Hub. But we sell gas to Japan and to Europe. And if you look at the gas price on the international commodity market for those markets, it's about between $16 and $18 per MMBTU. And I remember having a discussion with one of my colleagues at the Ministry of Energy, and he was trying to explain to me the very complicated way in which Trinidad have to estimate what the gas price that we will have, and so on. So I think a short answer is that the $85 is appropriate, and I think the gas price of $5 per MMBTU is actually very conservative. seeing what is going on in those markets that I talked about. But I want to get back to a point that Dr. Attzs make, which is the whole issue of the support services that we use for the economy, right? And TNTech is a very important institution in that whole milieu, right? And we haven't had a rate increase for more than a decade, right? And the problem is with electricity generation, especially in the last 3 years, starting with COVID, is that the capex in terms of developing the energy, the electricity capacity in country has shot up. If you look at the numbers, you will be amazed at how expensive it has gotten to put in place generation capacity and all those kinds of things, because capex, which is an important component of that whole arrangement, has gone up significantly ever since COVID, the pandemic and so on. So you have to be able to be in a position where the supply of electricity is reliable. Those of us who are a little older will remember the days when we had telco and TNTech, and every Monday morning or Monday evening there was some kind of outage or something like that, right? I always give the example of South Africa. For people who are not familiar with South Africa, just go and Google what is going on with South Africa and their electricity setup. And in South Africa now, you have rolling blackouts for sometimes up to 8 hours. Because for one reason or another, the South Africans did not make the kind of investment in the utilities that they needed to do. And to do that, you need money. And because of that, they are now experiencing these kinds of problems that has which create huge problems socially in terms of crime and so on, but also in terms of the business and the business environment and so on. So anybody who is averse or against the increase in rates to the electricity utility had to just go and look at that, because it is not as if you decided you have a problem and you decide today that you want to give more resources to TNTech, that all of a sudden this new generation capacity is going to be installed. It takes the gestation period between 5 to 10 years for some of these things. And therefore you have to, in advance of the problem emerging, you have to do what you need to do in terms of that. So I think people are increasingly recognizing on this and on other fronts that we need, if we want change, we ourselves have to be willing to change. The same goes for actually the Revenue Authority. And people often claim that, as Dr. Attzs mentioned, that is the government that is bringing on the Revenue Authority and so on. But if you go back and you read, for the last 10 years, in terms of the discussions that the IMF and the government of various stripes in Trinidad and Tobago have had with the IMF, this has been one of the recommendations about improving the organizational and the administration of the administrative systems in place for collecting taxes in Trinidad and Tobago. And that is what the Revenue Authority is. The minister mentioned the fact that we undercollect up to $10 billion. That is twice the deficit we have now. So if we were to improve our revenue collection through some things like the Revenue Authority, we could solve some of our problems on the fiscal front in terms of the overall balance, without having to increase the marginal rate of taxation and so on. I mean to say, I remember distinctly when Mr. Dukaran was the finance minister, I can't remember how long ago that was, he having an arrangement where he tried to collect money from, and I think he collected between $1 and $2 billion. In the mid-2000s, about 2010, the IMF and the World Bank estimated that we were under recovering up to between $6 and $8 billion. So this whole issue of the undercollection of what is legally due to the government is a serious issue. And one of the main ways in which you're going to try to solve those problems is the Revenue Authority. And with the Revenue Authority, I mean to say, I would hope that one of the things that they change is the amount of auditors in the Revenue Authority, because in order to ensure that people pay their taxes, sometimes some of these people, organizations and so on, have to be audited. You have to go in and check their income flows over time and so on to determine whether they have been paying their fair share and so on. So I think this is another major part of the puzzle, and people are naturally fearful of the Revenue Authority, especially people who work in the Border and Inland Revenue and so on. But for better or for worse, these are more the people who are going to be hired under the Revenue Authority, and they have to. Some of the opposition is related to that issue, but I think people have to recognize that if we want to make things better, then we can't stick in our comfort zone all the time. We have to be willing to make changes. And once the changes on a rational basis make sense in terms of how the country functions, and at the same time doesn't have any negative consequences in terms of my security of tenure and my income levels and so on, then you know, we have to go bravely into the unknown. So
as we wrap up, Dr. Seerattan, where do you see Trinidad and Tobago's economy in the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, I think based on the point that I made, I think we are in a better position than we were 2-3 years ago, but we're still not there. If you look at the growth rates in the economy, it's recovered, but it is not at the level before 2014. And the reason 2014 is important is 2014 is when the commodity super cycle ended. Yeah. That is where extraordinary high commodity prices on oil and gas were the order of the day. So being a petroleum or an energy-based economy, of course that has consequences for us, right? And that even reaffirms and reinforces the fact that we need to transition. Even if we get in very, very high income streams from the Revenue Authority, now is the time to transition when you actually have resources. If you look at the Gulf states, which is the sector, they are plowing not millions of dollars, billions of dollars into the tourism development. And we have much more natural advantage in the tourism sector than they do, right? But one thing is evident from what the Gulf states are doing is the amount of capital investment you have to make. The tourism industry, for it to be successful, is a capital-intensive program. The people are important, you know, but you need the capital to really be a competitive tourism destination, right? And it's on that front that I think the government need to make some more significant strides, especially with respect to Tobago. Because I think if you go to the hotels in Tobago and you go to hotels in Trinidad, I think Trinidad is fairly okay, right? But in Tobago, especially if you go to those hotels along Chevron Road in Tobago, and which have excellent views of the sea and so on, which is, you know, but when you go into you look at the physical plant and equipment and so on, you see people struggling because of the weaknesses in that area. And my heart goes out to them because, you know, remember, sometimes you get angry with them because of the kind of experience you have because of these problems. But you have to always remember that these are our people, right? When we're thinking about these things, we are trying to help them. And in helping them, we're going to help everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Dr. Attzs, you have the last word. You know, where do you see Trinidad and Tobago's economy in the next 6 to 12 months?
All right. I think that's a trick question, though. Next 6 to 12 months, we're heading into elections even more fervently. But I think, seriously, we're going to continue to be challenged for the foreseeable future. The minister estimates a deficit of about $5 billion. We're not too sure what he will come back and say when he does the mid-year review next April, May, thereabouts. But we are going to continue to be challenged in the foreseeable future. Conversations around accessing the Dragon Field, we know that those negotiations continue to be very delicate and diplomatic. So we're not going to see any returns from that in the foreseeable future. So what I think we need to focus on, in as much as we are going to try to maintain some levels of stability in the economy, we also have to try and reduce where we can. So in terms of like our food import bill, which is not insignificant, it is higher than the estimated deficit that the minister presented on Monday of this week. I think we need to try and control some of those things that are within our control, and to try and help maintain levels of stability and levels of comfort. The pain point will continue to be crime and security, and I think every effort needs to be made to bring that under control. And may I say that I'm not too sure that having more boots on the ground is actually going to bring the levels of comfort that we think it's going to bring. But certainly getting that under control, because economic growth and maintaining stability in the economy is heavily dependent on the sense of safety and security that every citizen and every foreigner and every investor and all of the tourists that Dr. Seerattan spoke about, that is of paramount importance in terms of getting our economy moving forward and maintaining stability, certainly in the next 6 to 12 months.
All right, great. And that's our show. Thank you, Dr. Attzs, and thank you, Dr. Seerattan, for joining us on this week's episode of Delving Deeper.
Thank you. It was my pleasure being here.
Join us again at this same time next week for another episode of Delving Deeper. I am your host, Ayana Carter, and from all of us here, have a good night.